So it is my pleasure to welcome Maize Brown Bag speaker, Jim McRae. So Jim has been around the Great Lakes and Seaway shipping channels all of his life and has shared stories about the industry in print, video, and digital formats. He lives in Montreal and he will be telling a lot of stories today, talking about his experiences with large lakers and ships along the Seaway and in the Great Lakes, and sort of how these stories, it's the storytelling aspect that he said has really inspired him to write this book and to share these stories with others. Out of this book, he's also working with a company, Griffintown Media, which he can tell you a little bit more about, and they've created some other companion projects to this book, and he'll be sharing some of those today. So I am going to hand it over to Jim. Thank you so much and welcome.
Well, thank you, Carlene, and thank you for the nice introduction. I appreciate the time and the warm welcome. I confess I've not been to Canton, but I've been nearby, so I have a feel for the area. It's a very pleasant area, and I typically mainly find myself on our side of the river in Canada, but when I go to the other side, it feels like I'm home because it's the river is constant and the people are constantly nice. So thank you for always welcoming me there. I chose as a subject matter to talk today. I chose a theme that the river ship runs through it. It's just the idea of playing on the story of the film, the famous film, but it's intentional because what ties us together in a lot of ways is the river, the St. Lawrence River, and the ships that ply the river um, are they are the focus of the various works we've done. They're uniquely designed to trade on the St. Lawrence River and Seaway and the Great Lakes. So most people in the audience will know this, and they'll recognize that form of ship existing today as it did back in the heyday of these ships when they were designed for seaway trade. They were specifically designed for seaway trade, and they have this very bespoke look about them, right? Especially the traditional ones like the one we now see on the screen. So the whole idea of creating this book, apart from I have this personal connection with shipping from even when I was a boy up until now, the reason is that we run a design company, graphic design company, and we tell stories through design. And when we looked at these ships, we saw their inherent beauty, right? They sort of reflected an era in North America where the look and feel of the vessels wasn't just that they were designed to be efficient. They are to lift large amounts of cargo through the channels of the Seaway. They happen to be designed in a very almost Art Deco and classic form, right? So the lines of the ships reflected pretty much the era in which they were built and the region in which they traded. And there's no direct, really, correlation between Art Deco and these ships. Perhaps there is some accidentally, but we do make a case that some of the lines that we find on the older versions of these ships occurring in the mid-century, last century, borrowed from the lines that came across the waters on the ocean liners of the Art Deco era. And I'm not an art historian, but quickly, Art Deco sort of implied a forward motion, a forward-leaning motion that suggested success and progress. And we see this in some of the builds that we now see on screen, but also on the waterway today. Some of these vessels, even though they were built, let's say 1949, I think this one would have been built in 1949, is still in operation today. So they're not just built to be lovely and efficient, they're very strong. So this vessel could withstand decades and decades of wear and tear on the freshwater and survive until today as a viable ship. Side note, salt water is not a friend of shipping. Salt water could really degrade the steel quicker. It just does. So a freshwater vessel like this American vessel here, one of the reasons why it is still viable is that its steel is very sturdy up until this point in time, right? But anyway, so that quickly, The whole idea behind putting these books and this project together was to celebrate this era of shipbuilding and shipping and sort of draw parallels with society without sounding um, too deep, and reflect that these ships have become part of our shared geographic area, and we identify with them, and they identify as being from this region, right? So a lot of times these ships will put into a port over the years, and the people in the port will know these ships because it's a frequent visitor to that port. And likewise on the waterway, if you happen to be on the river on a summer's day, you'll find people lining the banks of the river because they know a ship is coming by, and they'll go looking for it. They'll chase these ships, or they'll just happily see whichever ship does come by, and they'll record it, and they'll speak about it, and they'll share stories about it. And somebody's uncle will have worked on it, and kids will wave to the captain, and the salutes will come back from the ship. So it's a very real experience. It's a very personal experience for a lot of people, not just me, and probably people who are way more expert than I am actually at following these vessels and knowing about their histories. I just happen to be an observer, right? And so we put it to words, we put it to pictures, and we started by creating the first book, which was a coffee table book called Seaway Queens, right? So we created Seaway Queens with the idea of, let me see if I can flip the page down for you. We created Seaway Queens with the idea of, sorry, my control button's on the side so as not to interfere. We created Seaway Queens with the idea of taking what we thought would be the best pictures possible from collections in libraries and from sources throughout the waterway on the American side and on the Canadian side, and bringing them together to tell the story of the vessels in a chapter-oriented book. So each of the chapters in the book has a theme to it, and we go from the older era, from the mid-century up until the modern era, and we try to tell the story of the waterway along the way with information that's pertinent to the subject matter. So let me see if I can flip down, and we'll start with our general welcome. So our welcome page, in this case on screen, it looks just like a bunch of lines, random lines together. In fact, it's a technical drawing of the most beautiful vessel on the waterway. Still, it's still floating. It's not working. It's still afloat, but it's not working. The Ryerson, the Edward Ryerson, and she was built mid-century and is widely regarded as the most beautiful ship ever designed for the Great Lakes-Seaway. So this technical drawing at the start of the book actually is a real drawing that done of her bow form. So when she was built, like any ship being built, it requires a technical drawing to pre-exist it. So you build according to the drawing. And the naval architect responsible just for the bow part on this particular ship actually wrote the foreword to our book. And if you look at the cover of our book, my name's on it, and so is Mr. Joseph Fisher. Mr. Fisher actually helped design the bow of the Ryerson. He just retired. Very kind and gentle man, and a very knowledgeable man. And he helped me along the way and corrected a lot of my mistakes on the book because he's an expert ship designer. But his initials are seen, I guess, on this drawing, JPF. And he would have been responsible with his team to design the vessel. But in this case, again, he designed the bow. And the bow is her signature look. As she comes through the water, people know her immediately. Very beautiful, very attractive ship. And when the builders built her mid-century, they really much did employ that Art Deco look. But also, she was a very comfortable ship for her time. I think she was the first one to have air conditioning on board, and the passenger cruise quarters were more comfortable than most cruise quarters. And I think she had a passenger's quarters too that was really comfortable, right? So the whole idea was she was like almost like a signature of her era, right? Just after the war, America was very successful and very progressive as a nation, and the ship reflected that time. So the Ryerson, if people do ask you, what is the most beautiful ship on the Great Lakes, just shout out the Ryerson and people will love you for that. I did that once. I was crossing the border. Somebody was crossing the border into America, and the border guard happened to know the subject matter. And the question was, what's the most beautiful ship on the lakes? And my friend yelled at the Ryerson, and he said, welcome to America. Have a great day. So you could win friends too by doing stuff like that. So Mr. Fisher wrote our forward to the book. If you have a chance of knowing his name or research his name, please do. A wonderful gentleman. So this is a cover of the book, our coffee table book. The idea here is we looked all over for an image that would have reflected the best possible signature of an era, right? And we looked at this and we said, that's it, that's the one. And it's such a beautiful shot. The photography back in the day, in this case, black and white, was unparalleled, unmatched. I don't think you could create this photo today. It's such a beautiful work. Beyond the vessel itself, the photo itself really speaks to an era. And it comes from a museum. I'd have to look in the back of our book to remember the museum who supplied this. But it's such a wonderful shot. It's from a series. And it really does speak to a time and place. And to give you an idea that the vessels were becoming larger because the Seaway enabled bigger vessels than the ones that preceded. The ones that preceded were typically smaller for the smaller canals. So the Seaway allowed bigger traders. Just look at the two sailors up on the wing of the bridge at the top, right above the name Wilfred. There are two men, I believe, standing there. It gives you an idea of the perspective of their size versus the size of the vessel. So this vessel, American built, will mainly have traded in the upper Great Lakes from Superior down Huron, Michigan, and so on through the Soo Locks mainly. However, she has traded lower, I believe, into the Canadian waters and the Seaway of our combined area, but primarily she will serve on the upper Great Lakes. Nonetheless, her dimensions are Seaway dimensions, so she could come as far as where I live in Montreal, right? But the idea being she carries a lot more than the previous canalers that predated her. So she's a sister ship of the Ryerson. Maybe not so much. I take that back. Not a sister ship per se, but from the same era, about 10 years apart. But you could tell the lines are very similar, right? As a footnote, the Ryerson today is afloat, but no longer working, as I had mentioned, because she doesn't have viable trades for her type. The Sykes in this photo is still working today, even though it's an older vessel, because she was fitted at one time with a self-unloading system. And the self-unloading system allows vessels to auto-discharge, which is a huge advantage on the Great Lakes-Seaway, and one of the reasons why she's still commercially viable. So we'll touch upon that a bit later. And also when we have questions after this, after my presentation, you can ask me about self-unloading systems. But they're not unique. The systems are not unique to North America, Great Lakes, but they did start here. So self-unloading is a big deal for shipping on the inland waterway. And that's one reason why the Sykes is still a viable ship. I'm just going to play with my controls a bit because I'm missing my page flipper. Just give me 1 second. See if I can do this. Okay, this is a bit better. All right. I mentioned earlier, my journey started when I was a kid, a boy, in Montreal. We talked about, in the book, we talk about how this started, where when I was young, people in men in my family, mainly men, my sister, although did work on the docks for a short period, but mainly men, they would find work during the winter periods in Montreal, working down on the harbor. And I would just follow them because that's what you did as a boy. You just followed your family. And so I'd follow them. So during my school breaks and stuff, I would go down and get on board the ships during Christmas break and so on. And I would just sort of discover my way around the ships as they did their work, right? So as I did that, I began to, quite like them and almost fall in love with them. So I began to have a certain passion for these vessels from an early age, much related to my connection to my family. So, and my dad was a seafarer too when he was a young man, right? So I had this connection to these vessels. So I got to know them. Later, after university, I started my own business where we would do graphic design and storytelling. And this brought me back to, hey, let's tell this great story of these vessels that ply the inland waterways. And so that's why we find ourselves here today talking about these vessels, because my experience started as a boy and then developed over time. And then professionally, I continued to pursue my passion by telling the story of these vessels on the waterway. This vessel shot here is really of four ships top right that have been rafted together for the winter period in Montreal. So it looks like they're just about ready to leave with the spring thaw. So those four vessels in the top right, they would have spent the winter in Montreal and ready to go once the Seaway opened in the spring. The vessels in the vessels closer to us, those are foreign going vessels. They would have arrived in Montreal during the winter without regard for any closure of the Seaway, because the Seaway closes after Montreal and towards where you guys live in New York State, whereas it's open, the river's open from Montreal out to the Atlantic Ocean. So those vessels would have not wintered in Montreal. They would be visiting for foreign going trade and so on. So two types of vessels, two types of realities there in that shot. So I would have lived about 10 minutes from where this shot was taken, because I was living in downtown Montreal with my family at the time, nearby the port. I have an audio related to this too that I could send along to share with the group. I could do that afterwards. By the way, we could share anything from this presentation after the presentation that you guys could peruse at your own leisure. Back to the Art Deco flavor of the vessels. We go back to the Sykes, the Wilfred Sykes for a second here, and we talk about the Art Deco being the form of the bow and the sort of progressive motion of the bow leaning forward as if gaining success. Well, the stern also had this beautiful curvature where it would swoop in from where the anchor existed right down to the propeller. So it would have this beautiful line of an inward swoop of the stern. So together with the leaning forward and the swoop on the stern, you have your Art Deco feel with these Great Lakes vessels. I love this shot too, because it seems that she would have been, in this case, celebrating some event, perhaps even her launch, although I see some rope burns. I'm not sure if it's launch date, where people are visiting on the deck there and just sort of looking around and enjoying the scale of the vessel together. And I love the American flag on the back, fluttering in the breeze there. So it really gives you that feel. And also a note about the stripe, the lines on the side. That was intentional too. Those white bands and different colored bands, that they would have run the length of the vessel, right? And that would also lend itself to that sort of forward motion and sort of dynamic effect on the color pattern as well. So a lot of details would go into the ships back in the day. These days, I don't want to sound that it would diminish the expertise at all, but just the manpower, if you were in the people power, if you were to introduce this sort of technique on a ship today, you might not want to put a stripe right along the full ship side and have to do that stripe over and over again to maintain it. It would be a lot of work and a lot of expense to do so. Back in the day, they had style. So this is, again, back to the Deco, Art Deco. This is, these are certain other elements that we see in the design and structure of the vessels. In the illustration on the left side of her smokestack, with her stern mast, you could almost tell it had a flare, and it almost was a futuristic at the same time as being a period look. It had a futuristic sort of look to it, right? It almost looks sort of modern as well as being historic at the same time. But her stern mast, it just had a trim to it that was exotic, perhaps even back at that time. And you can't tell by the colors. There might have been silver in there and red, but because this is black and white, but it was very dynamic and very, very interpretive, very, very suggestive of a proud and confident era. On the right, I believe that is at her launch, the Ryerson's launch. And again, we see the full stripe going down her side. We see her forward house and the wheelhouse with her windows where the captain would look out. It almost has like a brow. It feels like an eyebrow almost on the vessel. You know, just above it, there's a line again going across. And we had designed this poster over my shoulder based on a similar photo to this. And we didn't get it right off the bat. The design team didn't get it until our friend Roger Lalive from the US, he writes an annual called Know Your Ships, and he's an expert on the Ryerson. And he wouldn't let us off the hook until we got that sort of brow and sort of brow look to her, right? So he helped us correct that, and good that he did it, because what we achieved on the poster is pretty close to what the reality of the vessel was, right? Again, we could appreciate the size of the vessel just by comparing her to the small tugboat on her ship side, and also the men, I believe it's only men, on the rail at the forward end. They look tiny compared to the size of the vessel. A small aside, back in the day of steam, there'd be a lot of smoke and steam smoke, especially from tugboats and also the vessel itself. These days, ship owners will not want to show so much smoke in their photos because everyone is aware and trying to make the vessels more environmentally responsible. But back in the day, a lot of the photos did have that sort of exhaust, you know, billowing out of the vessels. We could have photoshopped it out, but that would be tampering with reality, so we left it in. But it suggests also that sort of era of industrialization. Let's go to the next page. This shot is just a lovely shot of a ship launch in Ontario, Canada. A Canadian Laker just about to be launched, and we have the gentleman ready to knock the final stays away and have her slip into the water. I believe this is Collingwood, Ontario, on Georgian Bay. But again, we see the lines of the vessel here, and the stern, how it swoops in, very dramatic and very impressive, actually. Sorry, I apologize. And the propeller, of course, makes the gentleman look so much smaller compared to the. Sorry, I'm flipping too quickly. I'm just trying to maximize so you guys can see the bit better. The gentleman with his tool there. There you go. Yeah, there you go. Anyway, so she'd be sitting on the blocks ready for launch. And when the time comes and the signal's given, he would knock away the stays and she'd begin to slip into the water, ready for launch. Very impressive shot. And again, the photography, nothing to say. It's just beautiful. They had wonderful professionals back in the day. All right, let's see if we go to the next one. All right, so here is a bit to say about this. So here is our poster girl, the Ryerson. She would have been and is still the most beautiful vessel on the lakes. So what we did here is we took a still image of her from her current berth. I believe she's in Wisconsin, and bow on. We took a photograph and we replicated, used the photograph to replicate a poster that borrowed from the great ocean liners back in the day in the 30s, 40s. And there was a gentleman, an artist, his name was Cassandra from France. He did the most beautiful posters ever of these ocean liners, all by hand, and he would do them all by hand. So what we did was we tried to borrow from his spirit, and but use computers, of course, because we don't have the skill to replicate his work by hand. But our designer, Salma is her name, she was very painstaking in her technique about wanting to introduce shadowing effect, and including how light would hit one side of the bow and not the other, and there'd be a shadow on the other side. And also get that feel of the gradient from darker sky above down to the water line, where there'd be a gradient of the blue, for example, as you can see. So, but the whole idea was to interpret the style of Cassandra and hopefully not try to copy it, because you can't copy perfection. And so the idea being the poster became like a sought after item for people who love this vessel or who love the era. So if you like Art Deco, and if you like the theme, and if you like the ship, the Ryerson, the poster was available for you to purchase. Salma signed the poster and numbered each one. So I think there were 250 in total that were numbered and sold out across North America. We had a small map at one point we put together where the poster was being shipped to, and it was all over North America, from California to Connecticut, Ontario, Alberta, everywhere. So people know the vessel. They really appreciate that vessel. See if I could go down further. Oh, and just like the Cassandra technique, we would actually list the ports of call, the popular ports of call the vessel would trade to. I think Cassandra would probably have places like, Paris, sorry, not London and New York, while we have Superior and Hamilton. That's okay because she's a working ship, and those are the ports that she visited during her career. Not so much Hamilton because she traded mostly on the upper Great Lakes in America, but she did make several trips to Hamilton in her later years. So that's why we have Hamilton in there to get a little bit of Canadian content on the poster. See if I go down here. One more screen. Okay, so the technique for doing it, though, this is interesting. The technique started with us trying to interpret the Cassandra work of the Normandie that you see on the left. So again, believe it or not, that's all done by hand. So we said, ooh, how do we do that? So what we did was we took step one, a photo. We found a photo of the Ryerson at her layup berth, bow on. It was important for the bow. Then step two, we did a rough sketch of her using that base photo. So that's the rough outline. And once we had that, in step three, we began adding detail, but more detail per gradient and shadowing and things like this, right? So detail, yes, but more on the graphic detail of those little subtle techniques of using gradients and so on. But then step four is what I meant when I said earlier about her brow. She almost has a brow. In step four, that was achieved because Roger told us he wasn't happy until we got there. So we worked hard on getting that look in step four, and that's the final look of the poster. And it's over my shoulder just now, as you see, the real thing. It's a full-size poster, by the way. So it's like, what is it, 2 by 3 or something like this? Or it's actually the hardest thing in the world to ship by UPS or something like this, because it has to roll and it has to be in a secure tube. So it's a beautiful, beautiful work. It's the most frustrating thing ever to ship because sometimes at the border, they'll investigate various packages and they'll rip open the tube and they'll pull out their poster and they'll say, oh, it's just a poster, let it through. Then they'll shove it back in the tube and it'll get crinkled, and nobody wants a crinkled poster. So it's such a beautiful work, but it's very delicate to ship. Ironically, for a hardworking and tough ship, she doesn't ship well through the mail. So that's the Ryerson poster. And to continue the theme, so in our book Seaway Queens, we have end pages. So instead of leaving the end pages just blank, like white or black or something, we added croppings of the poster up close to make the end pages a bit more interesting, right? So we just took a snapshot of her bow, we cropped it, and applied the poster to the end pages. So when you do have the book, you don't have to have the poster. You could have the book and still have this poster effect in your book, right? So there's a bit of a value there in the book. So there's a lot to be said about the poster. Okay. So beyond the big poster and the big book, we created something very miniature using the same sort of theme. We created trading cards. I have one in my hand as an example, the same as that package right there. So we did a series of trading cards working with someone who's local to you folks. His name is Michael Folsom. He's out of Syracuse. I believe he has a summer place up on the river, right? So Michael's one of these ship watchers, and he owns a page on Facebook St. Lawrence ship watchers, and they chase ships. They have a whole following of people who follow these vessels, and they go out and they look for their favorite, or they photograph others that are new to them, and they put stories out on these ships all the time on their Facebook page. Well, we thought that was cool. So we took the sort of same theme from Seaway Queens, and we made the miniature version of the storytelling through trading cards. So the front of the each card will have a glamour shot of the vessel, and on the back there'll be details of the vessel for people who like to know the history or the trading pattern of the vessel, as it were, right? So we've been sending out these packs. I think I don't have any left. I only have my cover card. So we've been sending them all out through Michael in New York. Again, all over the place. So people have been collecting these cards and maybe even trading them. I'm not sure how much they trade them, or do they just want to keep them themselves, right? So this is the whole trading card effect. So that's another aspect of storytelling that we wanted to explore. And this is what the pack would look like with all the different vessels. From the traditional Laker vessels we talked about up until tugboats. Well, you have tugboats right there. And then the modern era vessels on the US side, if you see Paul Tregurtha, that would be 1,000-foot long vessel. So a vessel would be built in the 70s, and she would be landlocked to trade on the upper Great Lakes between Superior and Michigan and Huron and Erie, but she couldn't make her way down to where we live because she wouldn't fit through the Seaway. She's too big. But then on the other side of the coin, the ships to her port and starboard, the St. Laurent and the Barker, one is Canadian, one is American, they would have been designed to maximize their efficiency on the Seaway, especially the St. Laurent. She would be the biggest ship right now to trade on the Seaway from the Atlantic right up to Duluth. The Tregurtha couldn't go to the Atlantic, right? But the Barker on the right there could trade throughout. She's an American vessel, but she's smaller than the Tregurtha, so she could trade throughout the whole system because she could fit through the locks, any lock. So if people talk to you about 1,000-foot vessel, the Tregurtha is one, and you won't see her down your way because she doesn't fit. She won't make it that far. What else can I tell you about this? Oh, so those are the trading cards. And by the way, some of the vessels are new to the trade, newish to the trade. Here's one, the St. Laurent I mentioned would be new. The Barker would be newly built. And the Algoma Bear, she'd be sort of new, probably 2 years to the trade on the Great Lakes. So these are newer vessels. So whereas we see the Frontenac upper left as being a vessel from the 60s in a traditional Great Lakes-Seaway form, these other vessels now coming on stream like the Algoma Bear or the St. Laurent or the Barker, the one characteristic you're going to know right away is, or recognize right away, is that the house, the forward house, no longer exists on the new vessels as they did on the old vessels. So the forward house on the Frontenac would have been the area where the crew that navigated the vessel, they would live there. The mechanical crew on the other end of the vessel, they would live there. On these newer vessels like the Algoma Bear or the Barker, everyone lives in the same accommodation. So everything now is back aft. There's no longer the forward house configuration as we saw on the older ships. I suggest that, and that's fine for efficiency and sort of modern vessel design. I think the Frontenac has a prettier appeal to her just because you get the idea that the forward house is like has its own sort of living condition, its own professionalism, its own dedicated crew, and they live there, and the mechanics live back there, and it's just something cool about that. It's fascinating, I find. It's my personal feeling. Beyond that, we then discovered, okay, largely young people have not been served in our storytelling as much as we would have liked. So we created a children's book so that young people can enjoy activities and learn about the waterway at the same time. So this activities book is meant to entice junior mariners to enjoy the waterway. And they would do so by coloring, connecting the dots, discovering flags, flag messages through lettering on marine flags, what they spell out. What else? There's lots of activities in the book. There's a cookie recipe from a vessel, from a cook on one of the vessels. There's a gentleman who talks about installing internet and communication systems on board so that if the children wanted to know, hey, how does a sailor communicate with his family at home? Well, the technician explains this in the book. So these are the activities that we've introduced on the junior mariner side. It's full-on engagement of hands-on activities. Young people could even cut out different patterns and apply them to crew members, like safety gear or this sort of thing, so that the activity is crayons, is scissors, is glue, sketching pencils, whatever. It's meant to be full-on engagement for young people to get their minds and their imaginations going as concerns the waterway. It's been popular, this book. People have been carrying it in their bookstores across North America, and in some cases, industry itself has ordered copies so they could share it with their own community of worker families or sailor families, or even people who work in the offices. They could share it with their families at home, so everyone could learn a bit more about shipping on the Great Lakes. So it's called the Junior Mariner's Activity Book. Our host in the Junior's Mariner's Activity Book are these two sassy little characters here. Port and starboard, they're the boys of on the river or in the channel. I think we started calling them Portia and Stars, just to be cool. So they're the hosts of the Junior Mariner's Activity Book, and they have comments that they make throughout the pages, and hopefully it just allows the young people to have a bit of fun by recognizing some facial expressions or engaging in the back and forth between these two, who sometimes have a love-hate relationship going on a little bit. And the other interesting thing, and for those who are curious about technology, we've created an app accompanying our products. The app, what it does is it recognizes images, and it'll play video related to those images. So a young person who wanted to learn even more beyond the pages of the activity book, they could take and we, by the way, we mentioned to parents and guardians that accompany your young person when they go on the internet, because we want to be aware that we don't want to invite people to go on the internet when they're young and supervised, right? So we advise that older people should take part. Maybe they could enjoy it too, by the way. So the app, what it does is you take your phone, you simply scan, like in this case, you scan the images of these two characters here, and up will pop a video. In this case, it's one of the artists in a book who explains how to draw ships, because he was inspired as a young man to be an artist. So we have a video. His name is Tony Strublich, and he's from US, and he's a very talented young man and a very likable young man. So he provided a video that speaks to his art in the book. So you get the idea. Throughout the book, we have different people who have participated in content supplied to us that we put into story form, and several of them have supplied videos, so that if a young person wants to know even more about life on the water and the professions involved, they could use the app to access these videos. So that's pretty cool. It's not just for young people. Anyone could use it, but you get the idea. I think young people seem to be attracted to technology a little bit more than us. Also in the book, what we do is we try to explain different topics or subject matter related to the waterway beyond just the ships, but we talk about the indigenous origin of the lake's names from the various First Nations across North America. These names came to be, and how the First Nations were the first mariners on the Great Lakes-Seaway. So we talk about that a little bit. And going down to the coast, there's a group of people who are dedicated towards preserving whales who sometimes always exist in areas where ships need to navigate. So what they do is they try to educate crews on how to navigate safely amongst whale populations. That's a cool story. So we wanted to tell the kids how this is done a little bit, and also explain the different types of whales that are in the shipping lanes, especially off the coast of Canada, but we see Maine here as well. And sort of introduce the whales and the delicate environment they swim in and live in, and the need for the vessels to sometimes avoid the the areas, or to certainly slow down when they push the waters there, because whale strikes can occur, and we don't want to endanger the whales. So that's another example of the content in the junior mariners activity book. And there's some more here. There's a lighthouse. This is the Marblehead Light in Ohio. The kids could trace this through connect the dots. And a spelling bee, we have them match up the signal flags with and discover what they spell out. And we give tips along the way on how to do that. So they have to then investigate what each flag means, color the flags, and then identify the letters and spell out the phrase. So that's a nice activity to do as a family, even. So these are just ideas of what's in the content of that book. Finally, I talked about the app. I just showed you the app. So it's called Live Print. So we've activated the app on various products we have here: the Seaway Queens book, the junior book, the poster, and the trading cards. So any amount of content that comes to us in video form, within reason, we could apply to the app, so that the content, think of it this way, any content that we create, we could expand on, no matter what, no matter when. So if the book is printed and bound, we could still add stories to it through the app, video content. So that's kind of exciting, and it's for free. I mean, so people who have the products, if they want the app, they could download it for free and access the content of the different products. This brings us to the end. I wanted to finish with the app because it's the last thing we did, but I certainly wanted to cover all the other products that we created, from the initial book to the poster to the trading cards to the junior book, and all of that together, because it all started with one idea, and that was to tell the story of the Great Lakes shipping from a passionate person to a passionate audience, on the Great Lakes-Seaway. And it's been quite the voyage. So I hope you enjoyed my presentation today. I hope I was able to share a bit of information that you might not have otherwise considered. And it doesn't end now, because if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer anything you do have to ask me. So
Thank
I'll
you
stop sharing.
so much.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'll stop sharing this. Yeah, there you go.
Okay, thank you so much, Jim. I know a lot of that was not something I had considered before, and I've heard that there are people who watch the ships. I've met a few who were ship watchers along the Seaway, but I never really considered them from a design perspective before. So as a person who's really a fan of Art Deco, I appreciate that that is an angle that you considered. So feel free to unmute yourselves if you have a question for Jim, or if you feel more comfortable typing it in the chat, I will convey it that way.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah.
I can. Yeah.
I've always been fascinated with shipbuilding, but mostly with ocean liners, like the Titanic. It's got this rich history of being built in Belfast in Northern Ireland by Harland and Wolff shipbuilders, a very famous shipbuilding company. For these Seaway ships, where are they being built? Also, I noticed the El Gomo Bear. It had I think the shipbuilder's name, very small font at the very bottom. Was that a Korean shipbuilder that I was reading?
Thank you. That's a great question, Michael. The ships back in the day would have been built in Canadian yards for the Canadian vessels, American yards for the American vessels. Today, there's not a great amount of shipbuilding going on the Canadian side, although some yards are existing for repair work, and one yard in Ontario shipyards they do, and they have built vessels, including some of the vessels you may have seen in the pages we went through. But largely the yards maintain the ships now, and any building in Canada, I'm not going to say this blanketly, but any building in Canada would be more for military contracts or perhaps even smaller vessels like offshore tugboats and things like this, but don't quote me entirely on that. So the idea of building brand new ships for the lakes, ironically, now occurs by having them built in Canada, by having them built overseas. So if you saw a China build or a Croatia build coming in these days, and it's a Great Lakes ship, the irony there is they're built on saltwater ports, but they're built for freshwater trade. So what they do is they build them for freshwater trade overseas, and then they steam them across
the ocean
in a very careful way because they're not designed for the saltwater, right?
Right.
They're structurally the saltwater ships need to be designed heavier and more in a more sturdy fashion to withstand the forces of the ocean. On the Great Lakes, the forces are different, so they don't have to be so heavy with steel. But to get them across, they have to be specially fortified to come across. And they have to steam across on special weather routes, patterns, so they avoid nasty business on the oceans. So it's a bit of an irony there. The Great Lakes vessels of today are being built in ocean ports, largely. On the American side, the Barker, which I pointed out, she would have been built on the American side because America builds ships for the American trade and American shipyards, right? More so on the lakes than Canada would now, right? So it's a good observation by you. Will this change going forward? Well, the pricing suggests no, because it's very expensive to build ships comparatively in North America as you would in China, as an example. So unless the price drastically swings in our favor for building these ships, the market for shipbuilding is largely going to still be mainly the Far East. But as I mentioned, I think there was 1 or 2 vessels that came out of Croatia recently that were built for the Great Lakes.
Hey, thank you. Very interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting, actually. Very good point you make. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yes, Abby.
I was thinking back to the picture that you showed with the man who was standing by the stays, like ready to knock the stays out.
Yeah.
Is there any video out there showing the actual launch of a ship like that?
Yeah, you know what? It's a good question you have, because I'm gonna make a note of that if you don't mind.
If you can't answer it now, maybe you could tell Carlene and she could share it with us later.
Yeah, that's what I mean though, because I think I could probably find you historic shots of historic video footage of one of these launches, right? And how they did it in Canada, and I think America too, where they would side launch them. So in this case, the vessel doesn't slide from bow to stern lengthwise into the water. It actually launches laterally, if you could picture that. So it goes off the stage.
Yeah, and that's what I was wondering, whether which way or which angle it actually went into the water after that.
Yeah, it would go breadthwise, and it would create a small tidal wave. You know,
I imagine, yeah.
Yeah. So I'll make a note of that and see if I could find some footage to send to you specifically. You know,
I would appreciate that. Thanks.
Yeah.
There are tons of ship launching videos on YouTube, especially the ones that don't go well. But you're right about there's some where they launch a side launch, and there are people across the way standing on a dock, and they get washed right out there.
Well, I would like to see those, but I would also like to see the ones that go well.
Okay. I'll find 1 or 2 to send to you, Abby. No problem.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I don't have a question as such. I grew up in between Ogdensburg and Morristown on the American side, and when digital cameras came around, I always played with cameras a lot, but I started taking pictures of every single ship that went by for whatever time I was there. So usually it was a week or 2 each summer. So I have a lot of those of the ships going by. And one time I was actually at Jacques Cartier State Park, and a boat nerd, Michael will probably know what they are, a boat nerd from Detroit was camping next to me. and he was watching the water, and the wind was blowing from the northeast. So the St. Lawrence looked like it was going the wrong direction.
Yeah.
And I had to work with him for about 10 minutes to convince him that Lake Ontario was to our left and the Atlantic was to the right. It was a lot of fun. He couldn't pick up the difference on that.
No, you know what, that's just a practical observation. I mean, most people like would, if you could share that idea with a lot of people, that would help to understand that things flow downstream to the ocean and upstream to the lakes. And sometimes when the vessels are down my way, but more towards Quebec City, when they need to come into our inland, they have to what they call buck the tide, because the tide's pushing them the other way, right? So they have to time it so they're not fighting the tide all the way up into the freshwater. But yeah, you're right. The entirety of one big mass of fresh water is flowing from, well, it's your left to right, and it would be my right to left because we're on the different side of the border. But that's just your point's bang on, actually.
Yeah.
It helps people.
As a child, my father always said we are going up to camp or down to the city. And
Yeah.
I think I was in my 20s before I made the connection that we were going upriver to our cottage. And when we left the cottage, we were going downriver to the city.
Right. And that language was just second nature to him, right? I mean,
Oh yeah. He knew a lot of the river pilots. And one time we actually took our boat out and delivered a 6-pack of beer to a guy that was piloting going towards Cape Vincent. Dad tossed him up to him. He was on the what do they call it, the forecastle, whatever. He was tossing them up overhand, one at a time. The guy caught every one.
Yeah, those were the days, right? I mean,
yeah, that was about 1962, I would think.
Nice. If you have any more questions, I'm happy to answer them. And by the way, if not, and you prefer to follow up with an email through Carly to me, I answer all my emails, so I'm happy to do that too. If you want to share some images or video, I'm always curious, so that's good too. But yeah.
What is the capacity of the locks? What is the largest ship that the locks are built for to transition all the way back and forth?
Yeah, good question. These days it would have been, the locks now accommodate up to 740 feet in length and 78 and some feet in width. So remember that shot I showed you of the Saint Laurent, of the CSL ship Saint Laurent? Yeah, she would be maximum on the waterway. So again, it's a bit quirky. Therefore she could go all from the Atlantic up to Duluth through all the locks, including Sault Ste. Marie, whereas the bigger 1,000 footer can't come this way. So the Canadian ships typically are the largest carriers on the entirety of the Seaway. So they could do the whole system at 740 by 78. So they carry the biggest amount of cargo theoretically. Well, it's not just theoretical, practically from, let's say, Montreal to Duluth, they carry the biggest cargoes. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. And the depth is about, I think the depth now in the springtime is about just short of, it's just 26 feet of depth. And because of vessel design and the technology now behind steel and this sort of thing, they carry a lot of cargo now through the Seaway, those bigger ships. So they could probably max out at something like 34,000 tons of cargo in some cases going through the Seaway. Yeah. Good question.
I don't know if you wanted to mention anything about the Plimsoll line and the difference between a salty and a laker, and how the ship's different floating levels because of salt or fresh water.
Yeah, feel free, Fred, because the Plimsoll is one of the reasons why, by the way, is one of the reasons I came up with the idea for the children's book. I was standing on the lock in Messina because there's a visitor center there, and I was standing next to this woman, and we were just looking at the same vessel together, and it had all of these marks on the side, these little markings on the side of the vessel, and including a tugboat line and all these different things. So I just said to her, because I'm kind of quirky that way, I said, what do you think those lines are for? And she said, I have no idea. So we talked about every single line on the vessel, right? including the Plimsoll. And it just because those ships speak to you without speaking, they tell you what those lines are all about. They tell other people who share this common language what those lines are for. So, Fred, tell us what the Plimsoll lines are for.
Well, a ship floats differently or deeper, I think, in salt water than it does in fresh water. So each side of the Plimsoll line, I think the right side is the saltwater depth when it's loaded. So when they're loading it, they watch how the line sets. And so if it sits to a certain level and they're loading in a freshwater port, it'll come to a certain level if I understand it right. But then they can read how deep it would be in a saltwater port for saltwater use. So that's sort of interesting. And my memory is old because I looked it up a long time ago.
Yeah, no, and also it didn't exist prior to, I think it was named after probably a British admiral or something like this, like
Yeah,
Plimsoll. And it's for safety considerations to achieve safe load, debate.
Right. That's right.
Depending on the consistency of the water. There's even a summer mark, there's a tropical mark, a winter mark, it's quite interesting. And I'll see if I can remind myself, apologies, but we did a sketch of a vessel. And for the young people, we actually took a vessel and we put leader lines to show what every single part of a vessel is for a young person. And we have them, so we quiz them how to point out things, we give them hints. And one of them is the Plimsoll mark, yeah. And typically they are then validated by international bodies, shipping bodies that validate that mark to make sure it's true. So it's not just that you and I, Fred, could walk up with a paintbrush and put our own marks on the ship, right? And we have to,
Right.
they have to validate it, right? So they have experts who do that, right?
Yeah. I had one last Seaway shipping related comment because of your location in Montreal.
Yeah.
And maybe to let Michael know about something interesting. Are you familiar with the Empress of Ireland?
Yes.
Yeah, she's a sister ship to the Titanic. Went down in 28 seconds, not far from Montreal, on a cold winter day. And the first mate of the collier that struck her amidship was a Nugent.
Oh, come on.
I don't think I'm related, but
No, when you're driving the coast, the south coast of Quebec, towards like the Gaspé, there's a town there that is famous for being the closest town to the wreck, and they still do tours. They bring you out.
They have a wonderful museum.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Yeah.
It's a beautiful area as well.
Yeah.
I
So
got
I did
another sorry.
Sorry.
I have
Go ahead.
another question/comment. My dream job would be to work at the Seaway Visitor Center after I retire. But my question is, the Junior Mariners book, where is that available again?
Okay, cool.
We have it too.
Yeah, the first answer is the museum, and going forward, if it becomes crazy popular just because of this video today, and people are beating down the door, you could always get it at the museum, because then Carly could send me a request for more books, and that helps the museum, right? So you could order it, you could pick it up quickly at the museum, or order it from the museum. Going forward, I won't give you my information to get it elsewhere because I'd rather promote the museum.
Of course.
Jim was
Put in
very
a good word
generous.
for me at the visitor center, though.
Yeah. No worries.
Jim very generously gave us a great wholesale price and did not charge us the shipping from Montreal, even though I would have been very happy to go pick up the books, because I do go there somewhat regularly. So in the future, it might be a good excuse to visit him. Maybe
Awesome.
we could do part 2 of this on the Montreal side, but I did put links in the chat as well. If anybody, isn't here now, doesn't live locally enough, or wants to share it with somebody else, you can also buy them through our website. We can ship them to you book rate, so it's pretty inexpensive in the US. Or you can buy them online, pick them up here. We can hold them for you. Obviously, just call or email me. But yes, Jim is hopefully making a good some amount of money off of that as well.
The goal of any book publisher is just to sell out the first run, and we're on our way to selling out the first run of the Seaway Queens coffee table and a children's book, so that's good. So the next run, if there is one, that's where we make our gravy and we buy fancy things. Like, hopefully.
And for those who haven't, we'll probably have a copy in the archives here as well for those who maybe can't afford the book but just want to look at it. There's some really interesting, not only photographs, some other content that Jim didn't even mention, like, you know, if you geek out over boat history, he even talks about, you know, more historically going back to, you know, ancient times and how we kind of got into shipping and going through, you know, more of the scientific, how things work on the boats. And then I think the menus in particular are interesting, you know, the different things that were served on some of the boats. So there really is something for everybody. And we were even having fun here at the office going through trying some of the activities in the kids' book. So you know, it doesn't necessarily have to just be for children.
My wife loves the coloring, you know. She loves that, and she always colors within the lines. I'm impressed. It almost looks like a poster when she's done.
One last plug for something up there in Kingston. They opened up the Keewatin, which was a 1906 to what 1956 tour boat of the Titanic style, but much smaller. And that's available for tours now, and that's a wonderful tour.
Yeah, I think that would be a great recommendation, because it's like walking on the decks of a vessel. Well, it is walking on the decks of a vessel from like 1913 or something like this, right? It's really, really quite impressive. Yeah.
Jim, I was just wondering if you had any, you know, in your research for this book, you came across any particularly interesting stories that stood out to you as far as something that was shipped on the Seaway, or, you know, a strange accident that happened, or, you know, kind of those parts of history that you don't necessarily hear about.
Look, there were a couple. One I met a cook who I became friends with, and she bought a painting. And this goes back. This is funny you mentioned this. This goes back to ancient times where sailors were the biggest consumers of marine art. They would typically pay artists money to paint pictures of their own vessel. They were proud of their vessel, and ship owners would do that. And the artists in UK, for example, they would stand on the dock and paint in the background and wait for the ship to arrive, and then paint the ship in the foreground, and then sell it to the sailors because they love their own vessels, sort of thing. So in a quirky way, there was a cook on one of the vessels, and she came over with a vessel from China, was built there, and they stopped in the Philippines to resupply. And sure enough, an artist pulls up in a sort of like a small dugout or a small vessel, canoe type vessel, and he said, "I'll paint your ship for you, and I'll make you a copy." And she bought it, and I thought she may not have realized. Maybe I told her, but she may not have realized she's taking part in this ancient tradition of marine art. Listen, the vessel he painted for her would not make its way into the Guggenheim anytime soon, but it was something that she felt proud to have and to pay for. And the chap who did it earns a living by doing that. It's just one of these quirky little things that happen in the marine industry that you may not be aware of, and it doesn't have to do with the commerce of the ship or the efficiency of the ship or whatever. It's just something that marine people do, And I thought that was a really nice, charming story. The continuation of that ancient tradition of taking a picture, having a picture done of your workplace and your home, because that's her home, right? So she lives on that ship for months and months. So she's very proud of that. So that would be a non sort of money explanation of the shipping industry, which I found quaint. Kind of fun, very personal. I felt.